All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and get started because I'm super excited about this class. It was so funny last week, we had a few technical issues. There's always that feeling after you finish the first class, like, oh, I should have mentioned this, that, and the other. And then I had to remind myself that I had 18 more classes to go. So here we are on the second class, back for another summer of drawing. Thanks so much to Anne with the Vineyard Haven Public Library for once again co-hosting this whole series. I really appreciate it. Let's see, I had a few other notes. Oh yeah, for people who haven't been to the classes before, you can always catch up on the past episodes on my YouTube channel, Elizabeth Whelan. And also, no one ever has to show their artwork. This is sort of a thing of mine. I like you to be able to practice and try things out at home without having to have any pressure of showing your artwork to anyone at all. Now, sometimes people do email me if they want to, happy to see your work, but it's not something that you really feel you have to do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and set up my screen here to share. So another summer of drawing. This is class number 2 on the theme of home. And like I said last week, I'm trying to take a very basic idea and then just follow it through 19 different concepts as we work on different techniques. So building an igloo is our theme today. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to show you something else first. So I find it's really beneficial to, to think about how we go about doing our drawings, the different stages we go through as an iterative process. So iterations basically mean, doing the same action again and hopefully improving. So over on the right-hand side, the top image that's a little bit more high contrast of the boat, that's where I finished at the end of the last class. And I was looking at that thing sitting on my drawing board and I was going, you know what, I really want to try the idea that I talked about where, maybe I show a few more windows. Now I know a little bit more how to shade it. Perhaps I can get that bow a bit more accurate. That was driving me crazy. And some other little tweaks. And I thought to myself, well, why not spend a couple of hours and redraw this thing and see if I can move the whole process forward. So I did. This is probably maybe 2 or 3 hours worth of work because I was doing some other things at the same time. But I felt like I took this to another level. And I'm going to stop there. I feel like I've said everything there is to say about a houseboat as a home. But the feeling of home, I felt I got across a little bit more. The plants, the sense of something going on inside the boat. And so I just wanted to show this to you because it's really important to not get yourself tied up in knots that the first thing you draw has to be some sort of level of perfection. It doesn't. You're sort of going on a journey that's as long as you want it to go on. You may decide to do another drawing like this, or you may not. So today's artwork, I was able to get done within an hour, and I feel like it's fine. I don't really have that same urge to sort of take it on to the next step. But I just want you to feel comfortable and not feel as if you're not successful because either the first attempt, maybe wasn't exactly what you were looking for, or to worry that because you're doing more than one version, that somehow that isn't, that's not the goal, that you should be able to just sort of click your fingers and all of a sudden a wonderful image shows up. I think we benefit from letting the ideas sort of stew in our head a little bit and then maybe coming back to an idea later and seeing if you can do something more with it. All right, and just a really quick overview from last week, ways to sharpen your pencil. So we're dealing with using the beveled way of sharpening our pencil, which is just a 45-degree angle, basically. This looks like a little more than a 45-degree angle in this image here, but that you do on sandpaper, just to get that flatness to the end of your pencil lead so that you can make what I call washes of graphite. And then you can also use that same pencil, the edges or the tip for finer lines. And then here are these other ways that you can also sharpen the pencil lead. And the chiseled way is the one that I would try next if you're just messing around with this, just to see what that would do. For example, when you have a chiseled end of a pencil like that, that's really great for drawing little window panes. So if you ever have a bunch of buildings to do, you can have one pencil that you sharpen like that. Now, That's something else I wanted to mention. You can decide, okay, I've got a bunch of windows. I'm going to sharpen my pencil lead really quickly, do these windows, and then put it back to a bevel or a point or whatever you want. So those pencils don't have to stay sharpened only in one way for the entire time of your drawing. All right, so on to the concept of home. So when we think about building a home, for example, that's one sort of interpretation of the concept of home. The first idea might be, that comes to your head, building a home, guys constructing a house. That's sort of one of the ideas that comes to you first. But when you're telling your own story, you can sort of dig a little bit deeper. And in this case, we can dig way back into our own past to the idea of building our first homes as children, and that would be making forts. And so I remember making forts from sofa cushions with blankets, folding lawn chairs that we then put blankets over the top, using cardboard boxes. And then because I was living up in Canada at the time, making homes out of snow. So that is what we're going to try to do today, is to make a drawing like that. So we have now two images in front of us, and we're going to combine them into one drawing. And this is a skill that I really want you to be able to pick up. And it depends very much on being able to use your imagination and not getting tied into just the idea of one image. So we're going to use these two images, but we're going to bring them together and change them a little bit. So how do we do that, right? How do we get started? Well, the first thing we want to do is not to fall back on formulas and preconceptions of whatever it is we're drawing. So, what an igloo looks like, for example. We really want to pay attention to, if you've never actually built an igloo before, what that looks like. Snow does not really go together in very even pieces. It's chunky. It's not a smooth surface. You can make it a smooth surface, but if you're a kid building something, if you got this far, you'd be doing extremely well. So, when we think of the concept of home, a child building their own home out of snow, they're having fun. The snow has, there are footprints in it. There are pieces that have fallen down. Somebody's got to pat that snow together to make those blocks, that kind of thing. But we also can look at this scene and go, there's some stuff that doesn't have to be in there. We only need one home to begin with. It's unlikely this child is out there building an entire, village of igloos. So, and what's going to make a good composition? Well, I always like to start you with the no-tan, where we look at an image and then we work out what the light and dark pattern is going to be. But in this case, when you're combining images, it's useful to put another step in front. And that step is going to involve doing a very quick thumbnail of what we want the whole scene to look like. So I wanted to point out, before we started that, the second challenge is not to put any facial details on this little person. So I've reduced this picture down so you can hardly see any detail, because this is about the size. Well, he might be a little bit bigger once we put him in the igloo. And it's more about the shape and trying to make it look like a figure. But I think when we see the reference larger and we see his face and his smile, there's a tendency to want to cram a little smile and eyes and all of that stuff in there. So it'll be a challenge for you not to do that as we're going through this process. So the first thing for you to do, and you can start right now, I'll give you about 3 minutes to do it, is to look at both of these images and decide, what is your scene going to look like? So here was my thumbnail. And when I say quick thumbnail, I mean like really sketchy. So what I decided was I was going to take this little fellow and that opening and plonk it on the front of this other igloo. But I only wanted one igloo. And I kind of made my igloo a little bit rounder just because I liked that shape. And then I decided, well, I did like having the darks in the background of the trees. I'd leave that in there. And I wanted to also pay attention to the fact that there was some interesting shadows kind of running out to the right. So this is in no way something that I'm going to really, use as the basis for my drawing. It doesn't sort of take the place of a no-tan. But I have to, at some point, start to work out what this composition is going to look like. I have to have some direction because I'm going to make a notan based on all three of these things, this composition, the layout, and then what I actually see for shadows and not shadows in these two images. So it's complicated, all right? I'm not going to pretend it isn't. And if you're like, oh my gosh, you're only in the first 10 minutes and she's already making me do something. It's just, I want you to be able to get beyond your own photo reference, to combine images, even pulling in things perhaps that aren't even in here. Like you could literally put a large fir tree or something in the back. I wouldn't suggest that for today, but you can bring in other things that would make the scene look good. So while you're working on this, things to think about, for example, are, where are you going to place objects for balance? You can make the tree line larger, smaller, this, that, and the other. And also considering that concept of home. So I didn't think the extra igloos were needed in order to kind of get that feeling of home. To me, I thought, if a child is out there having fun, he's making one igloo. It's really, and then he's going to play in it, or he or she is going to play in it. And that would give it that sort of sense of creation and of building. So go ahead and wrap up your thumbnail. We're going to move on to the notan stage. I'm going to keep us moving along so you have a decent amount of time to do the actual drawing. So now it's time to do the notan. So based on your composition, what you're looking for is how to play the lights and the darks that you see. Now, the first thing you probably notice is that we don't have a lot of really dark darks. We have that background row of trees, if you're including those. And then we have these shadows. So for the sake of the notan, I consider those to be, darks, and I put them in there. When we go to actually draw, we're not going to draw them that dark. But to identify the shape and how you're going to sort of balance out how much of that shadowing stuff to put in and how much to leave out, this is a good time to do it because it helps you start to simplify. You're not going to put every single craggy bit of snow in there. It would get very, very confusing. And you really do want to have a sense of design to this, because once again, we're not trying to do a forensic representation of what an igloo looks like, because we're going to send this off to Mars to people who've never seen what an igloo looks like. No, we're trying to do a nice drawing using some techniques that we've learned to show this child having fun building his snowy home. So with that in mind, everything else that doesn't contribute to that particular story can get left out. Now, if you're having a hard time seeing with the kind of the light shadow color, seeing where your design could be, go ahead and squint. Don't forget to squint. It's particularly useful when you're drawing something like this. Now, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do something in the snow was to have a project, a drawing like this, where we did have to tackle drawing a white object on white paper. Because we're going to be relying very much on things like these patterns of shadow, the shadows themselves, the cracks in the igloo, and even the sky behind to help define the shape, rather than just putting a heavy outline around everything, as you will see. Okay, let's move on. All right, so this is where I ended up. Each week I'm going to show you kind of where I ended up, whether I stopped after an hour, whether I took it further. This was after an hour, and there was my little notan at the bottom. So you can see how I kept the features of the little person very vague. You don't really have a sense of, of age or gender or anything like that. And it was really more about the feeling of the light shining onto the igloo and this building going on inside. So this is just my interpretation. Within that hour time frame, you may end up with something completely different, but I wanted to show you this as we got started on the different steps. So the first step, what I'm going to do for each step is I'm going to show you sort of large what I did, and then I'll show you the same image smaller so you can follow along with the two reference images at the same time. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So the first step is to use a light pencil, such as a 2H or an FH or an HB, and carefully sketch the main lines of the scene, starting with a focal point. Don't worry about, the tiny little shapes. Just get the form relatively accurate and pay attention to what your thumbnail and notan look like so you can continually edit out those things out of the photos that need to be edited out. So I'm going to just stay on this particular page for about 5 minutes so that you can get your scene drawn out. And I guess as you go along, what you're going to find is you can sort of see this on mine. I've got lots of extra lines. I wasn't quite sure where something would be, so then I drew another line over to the left or the right. I did a bunch of erasing and moved things around. When you get to the next stage where you're being a little bit more careful, you will erase some of these lines as you go and you can neaten it up. But the wonderful thing about drawing in pencil, and particularly if you're drawing relatively lightly in these first layers, is that you can erase, you can move things around. So with the idea that we're using the beveled pencils mostly during this class, at this stage, you don't have to. Now you can. I used actually a hard beveled pencil and just I kind of flipped it over. So I was just using the sharp tip to do the drawing because it was a hard enough pencil. It didn't crumble. And I was able to do this. You could just as easily use a regular pointed pencil at this point. I have noticed that some artists who like to use the beveled edges or the chiseled ends of pencils also tend to have a handful that are just sharpened regularly, and they just intermix them depending on whatever it is that they're trying to draw. But I think the hard part about this, and this is why I thought it was so important for you to kind of see how I had done it, is to break away from the photo. And it's scary. It's scary to try to figure out, well, what are the proportions? How big would that child be? How big should that opening be? Oh, well, do the blocks all match up the way that they do? Because obviously this child in this particular igloo is not, it's not the same igloo. At least it doesn't look like it is to me. So you've got to do a little bit of adjusting. And here's something else to pay attention to, which is not so much needed at this stage, but it definitely will be at the next. The light is coming in slightly different ways in both of these photographs. So if you look at the shadows of the boulders of snow in front of the lower picture where the child is, you'll see that the light is coming from the right-hand side and is casting a shadow over to the left. And the upper igloo, it's doing the opposite. So I decided from my drawing that I was going to keep the light coming in from the left-hand side. I liked that. I liked that shadow, but it meant I had to pay attention to what would that actually mean for this child and the other shadows. Well, for most of the shadows, it actually doesn't make much difference because the child is set back far enough that the light is still coming in sort of at an angle that it will hit the body. But there are some of those shadows around the mouth of the opening that are going to be different because if the light is coming in from the left, then that shadow area that you see is going to be over on the left-hand side as well. That's where the sun is not hitting. And where the sun is hitting on the right-hand side, that's going to be lit. It's going to be the opposite of what we see right now. So it's one of those things on this particular drawing. It will not make a huge difference if you don't get it right. But it's the kind of thing that you do have to look out for when you're starting to mix images. You might have taken them from different angles. That might change the perspective. You might have taken them from different directions or different days, and that affects the lighting. And it's one of those things just to pay attention to because you will need to decide one way or the other where your light is coming from. Now I've drawn, for this example here, I actually darkened up these lines. If you were to see the original drawing at this stage, my lines were pretty light. Light in terms of pressure and also light as in using like a hard pencil. Oh, okay. So the focal point in step one to me is the child inside the igloo. To me, that's where the center of attention is, and everything else sort of falls off. But I don't have in if you look back at the notan, and actually you'll see it more clearly when we get to the next step. I didn't want, even though that's the focal point, I didn't want it dead center in my drawing. And so that's why I was so enamored with the idea of using these shadows that sort of taper off to the right-hand side, because it gives a little bit, a little bit of asymmetry to the drawing. Okay, let's move on to the next step. All right, so once again, I'm going to show you larger what I did for this second step so you can see what's going on. And then I'll show you again the image with your reference. So at this stage, you're continuing to draw and refine the main lines, but also starting to work in the masses in the lighter values and erasing lines that don't actually appear in the scene. So this is a lot to do all at one time. But what I basically did was, rather than redraw everything that I had done in step one really carefully, which I could do. That is definitely a way to do it. But I wanted to mosey this thing along a bit, make sure I could get it done in an hour. And so what I did was I started filling in basically areas that I knew were basically, I think I used the H or the 2H pencil to do it. I started filling those light values in while I was correcting the lines as I went. So this is a process where I just sort of started on one side and went from one side over to the other, sometimes came back and made changes, knowing that I would be able to, at a later time, either neaten things up or darken things up or change them. But I wanted to start getting a sense of form. And in order to do that, I used the light values, the lightest values, not doing anything that was dark, in order to start creating that sense of form. And if anybody has any questions, if you could put them up in chat, that would be super. And I will try to answer them as I go. So let me go on and show you with the reference so that you can do this step as well. So you can see here how I wasn't quite sure what to do with the interior, so I said, well, there are different values inside there, but if I squint, I really see something that's relatively mid-tone. But I'm going to go ahead and put down a light value anyway, just to get started. I don't really know how dark I need that interior to be, but I am going to, I'm going to start with something. So I like using these kind of washes of graphite, using the beveled pencil to get these light tones down, because I haven't committed yet. I haven't committed to the dark stuff. I can erase it and move things around if I want to, or basically color right over the top. So I'm going to stay on this step for about 7 minutes or so, give you enough time to do this, because this is a little complicated. You're looking at the reference and you're trying to assess from two different photographs how the whole scene is going to look. And it's not going to feel like there's a lot of depth yet. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things while you're sketching. One is, in these classes, I'm making you start with the lights and go to the darks. And that is not necessarily, how you're going to draw naturally when you draw by yourself. You might be like, hey, I really want to draw the little person and get some of these darks in and then go back and fill out the lights or whatever. I want to start with the background and then move to the, foreground, or it doesn't matter. There are people who start in one corner and do all their lights and darks and then move all the way across the page. And in painting, it's called window shading, because you sort of move down the painting, doing everything all at once rather than, in layers. So it's not as if there's a rhyme or reason. When I was working on that houseboat the other night, doing the longer version, I was just having fun and drawing all over the place. But because I had done the previous versions, I kind of knew where I was going, which allowed me a little bit of latitude. And for just getting started on these kinds of drawings, I think it's useful to start with the very lights, even though you're not quite sure sometimes whether something should be a light or a dark. You know that if it's going to be a dark, probably going to end up being darker, it's fine to put light pencil underneath because you're going to just end up putting more darker over the top. It won't mess anything up. And then what I started to do also, and it's probably a little difficult to see on this sketch, but I started to erase lines that really didn't have to be there. So I mentioned earlier how igloos aren't necessarily big rectangles, with lines around each one. And if you look at the full igloo and you squint, or you can see it on the other one as well, you see there are plenty of places where lines are suggested and then they break off. And then the next block starts a bit over. And as I went through my drawing, I tried to erase those lines that didn't need to be there. They were just there originally, so I could figure out what the form was. To start getting more of a feeling of realism into that. Now I've got my little picture of step 2 a little bit darker once again, just so you can actually see it. It's pretty light. If you're using an H or a 2H pencil at this stage, you don't have to worry really about too many lines being visible like they are right here. So I'll give it just a few more minutes at this stage. And I wanted to also address a couple of questions that were asked last week. Somebody asked me about drawing blades of grass, and I didn't see that until after the class was over. So actually, because I had to re-record that class because of technical difficulties, I actually addressed the whole how do you draw grass at the end of that video. But I'll talk about it for a minute now, because it's actually very applicable to what we're doing here. So when you're drawing something like grass, to begin with, from a technical point of view, you've got short lines, and they sort of taper off at the end. So you're going to start, with your pencil having a little bit more pressure, and then you kind of lift off as you go to get these little blades of grass. But I think the real problem with grass is people don't know when to stop. Like, how much grass do I need? So this is sort of where the idea of not just grass, but also, blocks on an igloo, and even children in this particular case come into play. When we're drawing, we're not actually trying to do, like I said, sort of a forensic, here is every blade of grass on the lawn, or here is exactly what these blocks look like, or even exactly what this child looks like, because we're not drawing a portrait. What we're doing is we're communicating to other human beings about something that other human beings already know about. So in other words, when I draw blades of grass, they're symbols. The marks I am making are symbols of a larger swath of grass, because I know that if you look at that, you'll interpret it. If I've drawn my strokes grass-like, you'll understand it means there's grass there. And likewise, a picture of a child playing in an igloo. We don't have to know that that's 9-year-old Henry from down the road or whoever. It just has to be a child. And that's why we're not going to worry about things like facial features and that sort of thing, because this is sort of a universal child who symbolizes every child that is going to build something. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. When you get the PDF at the end of the class, you'll see the picture of the houseboat, the new one that I did. That'll be included, and you'll be able to see a little bit more closely exactly how my grass strokes did look. They end up looking more like, cursive strokes. But I think it is important to, when you're trying to figure out where do I stop, that's what you think about. How many marks do I need to show blades of grass? How many birds in the air do I need to show that there are birds flying around? It doesn't have to be precisely the number that you saw that particular day. Okay, let's move on to the next stage. So step number 3. So this was the end of my step number 3, just so you can see where I was going. So at this point, you see, I'm really getting into those middle values, and I've decided, yes, I have to darken up the interior of the Igloo, I have to, start to add some more darks there on the figure. Figure's still not really well defined, but I'm just holding back on the super darks until the end. And now I'm starting to figure out how to work in the trees. So up until now, we've been doing a lot of stuff where it's been massing in sort of large, flat-ish areas, these different values. But now it's time to actually start building a little bit of texture by using lines that are spaced a little bit further apart. They could be of different lengths up and down. Even on the actual Igloo itself, I've got lines on there that, stop and start in different places so that some of that light pencil can still be seen underneath in certain places. And other places, I'm trying to emulate how the shadows sort of form around the different parts of the Igloo. So you're definitely trying to, at this point, start to use the shapes of value to define edges rather than lines. In other words, where, for example, like I don't have like a big line along the top of the trees where the sky meets. I just have the sort of jagged area that represents the top of the trees meeting that area. Where the side of the shadow from the Igloo meets the snow, I've just got, the darker area and then the white of the paper meeting that to form that line. So what we're starting to move towards at this point, and I'll move on to the picture with the reference so you can start working on it yourself. When you're drawing anything in snow on white paper, what you're trying to do is, you don't see any really dark lines or very few dark lines. You do see a few really deep shadows, between the blocks and the Igloo if you squint. But in general, there aren't lines all over the place. Instead, what we've got is we've got lighter values up against darker values, creating edges. And some of those edges are softer because the form is rounder, and some of them are sharper because the edge is either flat, sharp, moving out of the light, casting a sharp shadow, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll let you guys draw at this stage for just a few minutes. I'm going to mute myself for a second and drink some coffee. Yeah, I just saw in the chat about drawing texture. So next week in particular, we're going to start using the same beveled pencil technique, but drawing more texture than we have up until now. We're sort of like slowly edging ourselves into more and more complexity. But I think that this is where it's interesting to start to think about how your pencils are tools, not just for filling in shapes, but also for while you're doing that, trying to reflect the feeling of something. So I probably made my chunks of snow bulkier than what we actually see, in the Igloo there. And I didn't really do that on purpose. It just sort of ended up that way, which is a lot of what happens in drawing, I think. And my feeling is, hey, if it's working okay, you just roll with it. You can always either decide to draw something else later, or you can come back with an eraser to add different things in. But I think it's more about the idea of thinking about, just sort of thinking through, well, how do I make this pencil emulate that particular kind of texture? Do I just plonk it on the paper a little bit? Do I do smooth lines that are close together? Which direction the shadows should be drawn. So the light is definitely coming in on the main Igloo page from the main Igloo image, I'm sorry, from the left. That means the shadows are going to be where the light does not where the light does not get to. So basically the right-hand side of the Igloo, and then going out towards the right. And what I tend to do, and this is what I sort of was doing when I was looking at the particular, how was I going to draw my shadows? I tried to follow the form of the snow a little bit. So I kind of wanted this feeling of a direction from left to right. And and so when I was stroking with the pencil, I kind of stroked the pencil going from left to right, but not necessarily all in a line. Now, I should point out something that you'll see more clearly in the next picture that I show, and that is that when you use the Fabriano Artistico paper that I'm using, which everybody doesn't have to do, but I just wanted to point this out. And this goes for other drawing paper types as well. There is a smoother and a rougher side. So last week when I was drawing, and when I was drawing the houseboat that I showed you earlier, I was using the smoother side. Now today I decided to use the rougher side, which has the pattern, kind of the I don't know if it's cotton or linen, what type of paper it is, but there's a sort of a fabric weave to the paper. And so you'll see that even though I used directional strokes, in some places the texture of the paper actually took over. And the only really way to get around that is you either work with it, which I decided to do, or else you dig in so hard with your pencil that all the grooves in the paper are filled in with whatever lead that you're using. But in general, I think this is a good opportunity to start having your strokes sort of follow the form of whatever it is you're drawing. So in other words, if you're drawing the sides of the igloo as they come down, maybe have some of your strokes going downwards. They don't all have to, but a few. And then as the ground goes outwards, have your strokes a little bit more horizontal. And then you see those trees in the back. I've definitely got those vertically to represent that forest in the background. Okay, let's move on. I'm chatting so much about art, I need to get on to the next step for you. All right, so now this is can you see that paper texture in there? And I just decided to kind of go with it. So now it's time to get those softer pencils going and start to really work in the darks. Now I'm not doing a ton of dark on the figure yet. What I don't want to do is make him very dark and clunky. I want to wait to the very end and add some details in with a sharper pencil. But I do want to get the relative feeling of dark versus light at this particular stage. So what I now do is I'm now looking in the shadows for the darker areas of the shadows. I don't want to put soft pencil all over the place. I particularly want to be sparing in the application of the darks. But I do feel that, okay, there's some crevices, in the snow on the igloo. I did darken the interior a little bit. I put some more darks in the background on the trees. And let's move on and we can look at so you can do this stage as well. And you can start to see how the darker pencil is starting to bring a little bit out. Now, in some cases, like in the trees in the background, I did press relatively firmly to get that darker sense of the trees standing there. I will tell you, when I did the stuff on the inside of the igloo, I was a little bit more careful. I mean, I kept my pressure constant, but I was still feeling a little concerned. How dark do I go in here? And I wasn't quite ready to get super dark. I still wanted the child to be able to be darker. I knew that I was going to put more details in at the final stage on the child, just to sort of pump that up a little bit. So I didn't want to sort of make the final decisions yet about what was going on inside. So I darkened it up a little bit, darkened up some of the crevices between the blocks a little bit. And I also, here's something else, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, and I'm sorry if I didn't. When I did the trees and such, I turned my paper to the side and did them because it was easier for me to do a left to right kind of movement than it was up and down. Now, some people are very good at leaving the paper as it is and drawing all over it. I also, put another piece of paper down just like I did last week, and so I didn't make a big mess because I'm the queen of rubbing my fist through my drawing and making a big smear. Oh, and that reminds me of another question from last week that I didn't answer, and that was about using the smudging tools. Sometimes people call them blending stumps, or I think they're called tortillons as well. So there's nothing wrong with using those, and there'll be classes where we do use them. But the reason why I'm not showing you in these classes with this technique with the beveled pencil is because I want you to get familiar with what the different pencil leads will do, and how they will, and how a good pencil technique of keeping your strokes close together will give you that sort of sense of massed color rather than having to just blend everything. Now, blending is great. I do it all the time. It's fast and it's easy, but it also allows you not to have as much control. And I want you to have the control from the start. You'll also find that once you get used to using this sort of this technique where you are using the beveled edges, that and getting that, and getting these lines and textures as you draw, you'll become a little less enamored with using the blending stump all the time, because the blending stump takes away all that texture and you have to keep drawing it back in again. So it's a little bit of a toss up there. All right, we'll go on this for just a couple more minutes. Oh, actually, nope, this is time to move on. Time to move on to the next step. Okay, so we're coming in for the close here. So in on this particular stage, we're almost done. I'm everything but the sky is what we're working on right now. So at this point, this is where you add in all the other detail that you want and erase where highlights occur, thinking of the direction of the light. So you see here, I took out a lot more. I used my kneaded rubber eraser, and I have one of those erasers that's kind of like in pen form. And I took out more lines because I really wanted that feeling of the brightness coming down. And I put very carefully, and I used my mechanical pencil to do this, I put a little more detail in on the figure. And I also used my mechanical pencil rather than one of the beveled pencils to do the interior of the igloo very lightly. So I just sort of very lightly where I felt I needed that, that color. And I did that because I didn't want to just deposit more graphite. I wanted this medium to light value, and I didn't want to mess it up. And I felt that I could control it more easily this way if I used the mechanical pencil. And what else did I do? I think I just neatened up some edges. It was really mostly at this point about the focal point, which is this little person inside the igloo, and making the detail there. So once again, and you've heard me talk about this before, where the focal point is where you want the detail. If I were to start drawing little trees, little fir trees in the background right now, it would take your eye away. Now, sometimes you do a drawing where you do want all of the attention moving around a painting or around a drawing. But in this case, we're just doing something relatively simple. So I was pretty keen to keep the detail only in the one place. So I used the finer pencils only in that place as well. I do think I probably neatened up some of my igloo blocks as well. So keep adding in the detail, and then now you'll also see, and you can tell right here from how small my drawing is. I kind of put in a little bit of shading where the eyes and mouth area might be, but not at all worrying about what's going on in the face. Now, if your drawing has not gone as smoothly from step to step as this, do not worry, because I send the PDF around that shows all of these pictures after the class, so you can take your time and try it again and see if you can, come up with something that you do feel is more satisfactory. I mean, I've had the benefit, of course, of having this idea, thinking about it, having a plan in my head before I sat down to draw that you have not had. I'm just plunking this on your lap and saying, "Hey, draw an igloo with this little guy in it." And so don't let this class experience frustrate you in that way. I can tell you myself, having attended, not a lot of classes, but enough that I do my worst work at a workshop or a class. I mean, I finally realized that what I needed to do was just try the techniques, make some notes, um, at least have an understanding of what was supposed to happen. And then when I was home on my own time, I could sit down and actually, try to do the project and think it through and hear the instructor's voice saying certain things in my head. And that was just a lot better way for me to learn. And it's one of the reasons why I don't want to see your work, because that's a pressure, and what happens is people resort to what they already knew how to do rather than trying something new, because they want to, it's performance anxiety. We all want to do well and we want to get some type of praise, and so we just resort to the thing that we already did before and we don't learn the new skill. So that's super important to me, just for you guys to have a chance to practice, and also consider, taking the time, taking your own time to do a little bit more. Okay, now we're going to move on to the last stage, which is just adding the sky in. So this is what I did. I just took one of the first I did it in the H pencil, which turned out to be very light. And then I went in on top of that with, I think this was the HB pencil, just to get it a little bit darker. And what I was looking for was adding in a sky that's somewhat like the photograph, but see how I went up to the edge of the igloo to kind of define that edge there? It just gives a little bit more brightness and makes the igloo actually look whiter. So, whoops. So I'm going to go back to where this picture is so you can continue, even though this little picture doesn't show the sky. Um, you can see here from this reference material how the sky, the value of the sky is darker than the igloo. So however you want to do it, you can make it this dark if you want to. I just went as far as an HB pencil that I did a very consistent but not very heavy pressure in order to get that kind of color. But it just made, going from this step to adding in that sky, just made a little bit more of a sense of snow, of brightness, of the light shining down. I'm not sure if we'll have another opportunity to do another sort of snowy scene, but I did want to mention that for those of you who, I mean, it's so wonderful, isn't it, when the snow falls and you go out and you see these beautiful scenes, and you do want to draw them. And the best way to approach it is to think of the paper, the white of the paper, as the snow. So you don't necessarily have to draw the snow. All you're drawing is shadows and any other forms that exist. So in this case, we're just drawing the trees. We're drawing the shadows that are cast by the light hitting one side of the igloo and not the other. And then the little person. Everything else is just a shadow shape. And then, so when you're drawing, for example, you see trees and you see the beautiful shadows on the snow. All you have to worry about is getting the tree in the right place and the shape of the shadow. So the shape of the shadow defines a little bit about, what the terrain is like around it. In this particular case, it's, somebody's been tramping back and forth. They've been building blocks of snow. Looks like it snowed again. So you've got a lot of unevenness going on. A freshly fallen snow in the woods will have a softness to it as it blankets, mounds of leaves and that kind of thing. So that's a really good opportunity just to squint, look at the shapes of the shadows, try to get those in the right place and as accurate as possible, and then not draw more of the tree or whatever it happens to be, the building, than you actually see. Because the white of the snow is the white of the paper. You're only having to worry about the dark stuff and the shadows, nothing else. And it'll just simplify your life quite a bit. I like it, just like we did today, kind of backing into the darker values when you're doing snow, starting with those super light ones that you can hardly see, and then moving forward. Now, as you do your own drawings, if you've got a range of pencils that's got 7 pencils going all the way from 4H to, 6B or whatever, you're going to become adept at holding those like you might a palette, a bunch of brushes, if you're a painting, and selecting the right one. So when I was working on the houseboat last night, sorry, a couple of nights ago, I was holding actually 4 of my pencils in order, from dark to light, so that I could grab the right one and use it as I was drawing along. Just made my life a lot easier. I wasn't continually digging through, the tray or my desk or whatever. So you'll start to find that the you'll become more and more familiar, the more you do this, what those different um, leads will do. You know, which ones are light, which brands you like, which ones are dark, which ones are more crumbly. And you'll be able, and also which ones hold a point better, which ones would you like to have, you know, a regular pointed pencil as well as a beveled end, et cetera, et cetera. And so it comes back down, as I always say, to observation and practice. And if you can, even if you don't want to do a snowy scene like this week, just continue to practice with those beveled edges, because we will do next week, we will work with them a third time, and then the week after we'll be doing something with toned paper, which will be a completely different technique. So I just want you to get a really good sense that you know how to do nice washes of graphite using your different pencils, and have an understanding of how this works. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the to this picture again, just so you can see this again. Just to, you know, this is not a detailed drawing. It's just a kind of drawing that can get done in an hour. It gives a feeling of the scene. And it's always interesting to me to end up at this point and kind of go, okay, is this is this where I meant to go? Because sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Okay, if you'd like to go ahead and wrap up your drawings at this point, I'm just going to go back to the reference for a second so you can continue to see that, and just spend a few more minutes on this. I am going to point out also, don't forget to use those erasers. This is a really good point also to clean up any smudges you've got, to erase any bits you really don't you think you need because they're not, you know, useful to the form. I think I probably picked out a couple of extra highlights on the little figure, and on the snow that they're holding. Uh, you know, you know how much I like using the eraser as a tool. Okay, folks, let me go ahead and move on and wrap up for today. Okay, so when it comes to this is sort of taking what we've talked about the last couple of classes and putting them together. When it comes to a concept, it's really great to tell your own story. So I feel very, you know, I feel very close to the idea of kids playing in snow forts, and you may have had a completely different experience, you know, when you were growing up, something that was very different with the idea of home. But I think what's important is just to brainstorm, trying to get beyond the formula. So, you know, that first idea of building a home, you know, was the guys out doing construction. A little bit more thought, you know, it takes you a little bit further down the road. I think it's good to noodle on ideas for a while before you jump in and start drawing something. If you work up your drawing from the start with the idea to a concept, that way, even if you've got a number of different images that you're working from, you can keep assessing and going, okay, am I on target with this idea that I'm trying to do? Or am I putting in extra, you know, extra igloos and things that really don't contribute to the story? And then use as many iterations as you want. You know, sometimes you'll just dive right in, you'll just start drawing, it's not a problem. Other times you might, especially when you're mixing different reference material together, you might find that it's helpful to take it through a few stages and really think about how it's going to, what your plan is. Because then the end part is more fun, because then you know your composition is going to work and you have an idea of where you're going and you're just drawing and enjoying yourself. For me, that involves listening to an audiobook or something as well. So when it comes to technique, make good use of that white paper. Avoid putting outlines around everything if you can. And if you had to start with, which I definitely did to start with the Igloo, you know, erase them as you go, incorporate those lines into the other values that you're using to show the edges, and then use other values like the sky to show the edges of white objects. So as the sky comes up to the edge of the Igloo, that kind of defines an edge without me having to put a big dark line there. It's just a little bit more of an effective way to draw. The other thing is this business of looking for lost edges. In other words, places where there isn't a line. So as one block sort of fades into another snow block, if there isn't an indentation, it just looks like continuous white, and you want to draw it like that. It gives that sense of realism. And we're starting with realism really because it's it's a way for us to know if we're getting the right idea. You know, are we managing to control our our materials in a way and our technique in a way that we can make something look representational. Now, as we go on through the summer, we're going to get less representational as we go, and we're going to get a little bit freer. But for the moment, we are trying to sort of draw things the way that we see them. So get those first layers down using the beveled pencil to quickly create the values that you need. Come in again at the later stages with sharper pencils, lighter or darker, whatever you need just to tighten things up. Use directional strokes to add interest and also to represent the different planes of objects, you know, the different sides of the blocks, and to start to build texture, which we'll do more of next week. And there's no need to get detailed on figures. Just concentrate on the light, medium, and dark values and shapes that you see. Figures in your drawings are usually, unless you're doing a portrait, they're symbols. They're symbols of people. And so we don't have to get super detailed on them. All right. If anybody needs to get in touch with me during the course of the week, you or anytime, you know how to reach me. Any of these ways will be fine. I'm always glad to hear from you. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Wow, I can't believe we did that right on time. I've got little post-it notes telling me when I have to move along, keep it going. All right, that was a lot. For some of you, it was probably the very first time you tried to make a drawing out of two different images, and I know that that's a challenge. But we'll have something new to try next week. It'll still be using the beveled pencils, so keep working on that and just sort of see how it goes. It's something that as you get more familiar with over time, you'll find you resort to a lot because it's fast. It just takes a little while to get that pencil pressure. And I will tell you, I do have an extra piece of paper to the side that I use, you know, to get the angle right before I come over to the page. Otherwise, you find yourself making lines as well as flat areas. So I kind of get my pencil angle right over to the side, and then I come back over to the page. I should have probably mentioned that a little earlier. But like you, I don't always draw like this. And so I have to find little ways to make sure that, you know, I can get to success on the drawing as well. All right, folks, until next week, I look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the library and to Anne, and look forward to seeing you again soon.